Well, hi again. In this video, we get to look at John chapter 10 together for a few minutes. This is another chapter that contains several really important statements of Jesus, things he said that are well known and that are kind of a key to understanding who he is. This chapter also contains a word picture that Jesus used that would have made sense to the people he was speaking to, but might require a little explanation for us. So let me explain that image and then we'll talk about some of those key statements. Jesus uses this image of a shepherd and sheep. And the situation that his readers would have been familiar with is that at that time, sheep belonging to different owners and managed by different shepherds would have been all kept together in a common pen at night for safety. They would all have been brought together and locked up so they could be protected kind of by a minimum amount of people overnight. And then in the morning, the different herds would be brought out by the different shepherds. And the system depended upon familiarity. Sheep weren't going to wander off with some strange shepherd. They would stay with their herd and follow the voice of their shepherd. So that's what Jesus is talking about in verses 1 through 5. Let me just read those. It says, "Very truly I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs in by some other way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is the shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. But they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice." So Jesus sets the stage for what he wants to say by introducing a few different characters here. There are thieves who don't even enter by the gate. There's the shepherd who enters by the gate. There's the gatekeeper who recognizes the authority of the shepherd and lets him in. And there are the faithful sheep who know their master's voice and follow him. And Jesus seems to be saying there was never a real danger they were going to follow a thief because they know better. And then in the verses that follow, Jesus makes the next two of the I am statements that we've talked about in the book of John. Remember, there are 7 of them. And so far we've seen the first 2, I am the bread of life, and I am the light of the world. Well, now he says in verses 7 and 9, I am the gate. In other words, he is the one true path that the sheep are going to take. Verse 8 says, all who have come before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep have not listened to them. A thief can try to convince the sheep to hop the fence, but that's not happening. The sheep are going to use the gate. And then he says in verses 11 and 14, I am the good shepherd. In verses 11 and following, he explains that a good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep because he cares for them. In verse 14 and following, he says, I know my sheep and my sheep know me. He says he has other sheep who are not of this sheep pen, which is referring to Gentiles outside of Israel, not about aliens. Sorry to disappoint you. And then he says, they too will listen to my voice. And then to kind of complete the picture, if you skip ahead to verses 26 and 27, Jesus says to these religious leaders, you do not believe because you are not my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them and they follow me. So if you put all that together, what you get is this picture that there are people who are going to respond positively to Jesus when they meet him, whether that was in person at this time or as they hear about him today. They're going to respond with faith because they are his sheep. Jesus is saying when people don't believe in me, that's not a statement about me. That just shows they're not my sheep because my sheep know my voice. All of that is in the context of this conversation that started back in chapter 9, where he's telling the Pharisees that they're spiritually blind. It's like he's saying, if you want to know why this formerly blind man has faith in me and you don't, I'll tell you. He heard my voice and came running because he's my sheep and you're not. And there are several other big statements in this chapter that I don't have time to dwell on, but I want to at least mention them. In verse 10, Jesus says, the thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full, or have abundant life in some translations. John 10:10 is a well-known verse. It's often a misunderstood verse because when Jesus says life to the fullest or abundant life, we have to be careful to let him define what that means. He's the one who will tell us, he'll show us what a full life is like. we can't take this verse to mean he's promising lots of money or something like that. Life in Jesus is the best possible life. But if you think about some of the statements we've seen earlier in the book about him satisfying our spiritual hunger or our spiritual thirst, then you'll have kind of a good idea of what he's talking about here. And then notice that the thief comes to destroy. We do have an enemy who makes a lot of empty promises, but the effect of sin in our lives is never to make life better. It always leaves damage in its wake. And then there are these repeated statements about Jesus laying down his life. He's, of course, referring to the cross. They don't know that yet. He says that's what makes him a good shepherd. He says the Father loves him for doing it. And then this important statement, he lays down his life in verse 18. No one takes it from him. He has the authority to lay it down and to take it up again. So it's voluntary. He's saying this is the plan. He's making the claim here to be stronger than death itself. And then he says in verse 27, speaking of his sheep, that he gives them eternal life and they shall never perish. We've seen statements like this before in chapter 6 with the repeated statement, I will raise them up at the last day. So this is another promise to give eternal life to those who believe. And then this statement in verse 28, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. And he repeats that in verse 29, no one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. This is a statement about assurance. When you belong to Jesus, you might struggle with doubt, you will struggle with temptation, but the great news is that it doesn't all depend on you holding on to him. If you belong to him, he's holding on to you, he's got you, and he's not letting go. Well, then one more. He follows that up with verse 30 and the claim, I and the Father are one. He repeats that idea in verse 38, the Father is in me, I am in the Father. That's the kind of statement that sounded like blasphemy to these religious leaders. We've seen Jesus say things like this before. When we get to chapters 14 and 17, we're going to see a lot more of this idea that Jesus is in the Father is in him. We'll talk about those ideas then. For now, thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.